Hello and good evening all. Thank you for joining us this evening, and in a continuing re-record motif, this evening we're taking a look at the Lola T70. In this instance, we're doing the re-record because I got some really good photos of the T70, both at Le Mans Classic last year and this past weekend at Daytona, and the original video really did pretty well, so it seemed like an appropriate time to go back to take a slightly deeper dive into the most iconic and well-remembered sports prototype to be born from the mind of one Mr. Eric Broadley, MBE. Mr. Broadley was born in Brumley in 1928 and spent his early post-war years working for a builder as a quantity surveyor alongside his close colleague Ethel the Aardvark. Unlike Ethel, whose primary avocations were devastating the local termite populations and a bit of light domestic terrorism, Mr. Broadley passed his non-working hours racing modified Austin 7s, competing against others who would become notable in the sport later, such as Brian Hart and Colin Chapman. His first notable success as a constructor came with the building of the Broadley Special in 1956, which was sufficiently competitive that he received substantial interest from other racers looking for an alternative to Chapman's Lotus 11. What resulted became the Mark I, with the Lola nameplate reportedly lifted from a popular musical number at the time, which surprisingly enough I'm not being sarcastic about, and after the rather expected teething issues were worked out, the Lola Mark I was more than a match for the Lotuses, and started to take wins at both a regional and national level, most notably class wins at the 1959 RAC Tourist Trophy and the 1960 12 Hours of Sebring, in both instances driven by Peter Ashdown, with the early successes bringing orders for 3 more cars. The following 3 years saw continued interest in and improvement of the design, with nearly 40 cars produced in total, and at that point the Lola company branched out into open-wheelers as well, starting with the rather unsuccessful Formula Junior Mark II and Mark III, and following it up with, quite ambitiously, a Formula One chassis, the Mark IV, which, while not an exceptional design, did at least prove occasionally competitive, much more so when the cars were sold down under in 1962. The Mark V was another Formula Junior attempt, but the Mark VI is where our examinations begin in earnest. The Mark VI was Lola's first attempt at a GT car, and in keeping with Mr. Broadley's interests in innovation, it represented a fundamentally new direction in that section of vehicle design. Mid-engined cars were coming back into vogue in single-seaters, following Cooper's success with that layout, and Porsche had used it on their small hill-climbing sports cars since the mid-1950s, but there were 2 fundamental challenges that, up to that point, had prevented much development in the way of large-engined, mid-engined GT cars. First, the availability of sufficiently robust gearboxes suited for mid-engined applications, and secondly, FIA homologation. The first of these issues, arguably the easier one to resolve for anybody with experience dealing with governing bodies, was solved with the development of a 4-speed Colati gearbox intended for a Lotus Indy 500 entry, and the second came, perhaps unsurprisingly, with the FIA's ever-shifting rules, which changed in 1962 and opened the side door for so-called experimental Grand Tourers, or, as we call them today, prototype racers, with no production minimum, but a continued expectation of at least a nominal nod to roadworthiness. Thus, Mr. Eric B., not half a B, even philosophically mind you, created the Mark VI GT, working with a John Frayling, who designed the bodywork, and it was indeed experimental, innovative, and arguably even prescient in its design. The first chassis had a steel monocoque, but the intent was always for a primarily aluminium construction. The Mark VI was one of the first cars to have a monocoque chassis, debuting slightly after, and admittedly inspired by, the Lotus 25's design, while pretty much everyone else was still using tubular space frames. It used the engine and transmission as a stressed member of the chassis, which was unusual even for Formula One cars of the time, virtually unheard of for anything else. It was obviously mid-engined, and there were a raft of styling features to either help performance or usability for the futuristically shaped car. The bodywork was fiberglass, not admittedly that unusual, but still a nice feature for the time. The engine air intakes were integrated into the roof. The doors extended into the roof to ease ingress and egress, and the rear featured a cam-esque tail to counter the challenges of aerodynamic lift that were becoming increasingly prevalent as racing speeds climbed well past the 150-mile-an-hour mark in the late 1950s, which, for our friends in foreign lands, is about 255 kph. Despite this inarguably promising set of features, only 3 cars were produced. The initial prototype with the steel monocoque was used as a display car and saw some competition in 1963, while the first of the 2 aluminium chassised cars was being finished for a Le Mans entry that same year. Unfortunately, a lack of preparation time meant that it arrived with gearing for a shorter, low-speed circuit, and as such the car didn't put in the best showing, running nearly 50 kilometers an hour, or 30-ish miles an hour slower than expected, and retiring in the early morning hours with mechanical issues. This car, however, was purchased by Ford, who were intrigued by its potential, and we'll discuss more shortly. Chassis 3, which was termed LGT-2, was sold to Mecum Racing, who ditched the rather underpowered 4.74-liter Ford power plant after a premature failure at Brands Hatch, replacing it with a 6-liter Chevy
V8 motor, and
campaigning it in the States with much greater success. Chassis number 2, LGT-1, the original chassis was LGT-P, is the true next step in our story, however. It was acquired by Ford as part of their exploratory work on attaining victory at La Sarthe, coincident with the breakdown of their attempt to purchase Ferrari earlier that same year. The Dearborn Mark also contracted broadly as a consultant to help guide the design of their Ferrari beater. He was partnered with John Wyer, late of the Aston Martin Works Le Mans outfit, as intended team manager, Roy Lunn from Ford, and they were overseen by a Mr. Harley Kopp, as the new Ford Advanced Vehicles division, headquartered on an industrial estate in Slough. Lunn was chosen as he was the only Ford engineer with any experience designing a mid-engined car after his work on the abortive Mustang 1 concept. They made progress on developing early versions of what became the GT40 Mark I, but broadly left after just under a year, following conflicts between himself and other members of the team, mostly around adapting the race design for road use. With our paths again diverging, as in a wood, Broadley returned his full focus to Lola, and commenced work on a car that would come to compete not only with his former project, but with the other great names of the racing world in those days. This new car was the T70, and it benefited from the learnings that Mr. Broadley had taken both from the Mark VI and the GT40 program. One of the key conflict points driving his departure from the latter project was Ford's insistence on a steel monocoque rather than the blended design that he pioneered in the Mark VI, this driven in no small part due to the fact that Ford was in good with the Steel Manufacturers Union and wanted to represent American interests in that sense. But, thus, the new T70 retained Broadley's favored formula, using lightweight materials wherever possible, and resulting in an initial 60-40 split for the chassis between steel and aluminium. The chassis was configured to accept a variety of engine options, predominantly American V8s, with Chevrolet V8s in the 5 to 6 liter range proving particularly popular as the model matured, although there was a rather disastrous partnership with Aston Martin in 1967, which we'll discuss further shortly. All engines fitted to the car sent power to the rear wheels, generally through a Hewland 4-speed gearbox, which, in keeping with the rest of the car, was advanced for the time, featuring lightweight magnesium construction, an integrated oil pump, and 14 quick-swap gear sets that could be changed in around 30 minutes. Suspension was double wishbones and coilovers at the front, with lower wishbones, top links, and twin trailing arms at the rear, a setup that Broadley had developed for his earlier cars. Debuting in 1965, the first T70s were available only as Spyders, open-topped and windshieldless for minimum drag, minimum weight, and design simplicity, and hanged be the bugs that get on your helmet or teeth depending on if you use a closed helmet or not. Bodywork, as with previous Lolas, was custom fiberglass panels sourced from specialized moldings. The bodywork was reportedly a collaboration between Broadley, Specialized Moldings' Jim Clark, not the F1 great, and a rather young designer and engineer named Tony Southgate, who might manage one or two other notable designs later in his career. There was also a Mike Smith tapped to design the doors because, in Mr. Southgate's own words, he hated doing doors. Specialized Moldings' Jim Clark reportedly had also done some work on designing other bodywork the firm was contracted to build, including the Lotus Elan fixed-head coupe, the McLaren Mark VI, and the Chevron B16, the latter two of which one can certainly see a familial resemblance with the T70, especially once the T70 gets a roof. Getting back on track, the brakes on the T70 were relatively commonplace for large racing cars of the era, using big gearling discs, but these were not in their traditional location close to the wheels and tires, rather mounted inboard of the suspension uprights, shown here. This choice provides a number of benefits, including improvements to brake cooling, while mitigating the impacts of brake heat on tire temperatures and pressures, and reducing unsprung weight into the bargain, all elements that improve performance. The main drawback is, of course, a not insignificant increase in mechanical complexity, which, under certain circumstances, can create greater servicing challenges depending on the specific design elements chosen, particularly during races, and the risk for greater heat loading on the transmission when the rear discs are mounted next to the transaxle. This latter issue can be ameliorated with additional transmission cooling, but that's a subject for another time. To campaign the T70 as a works team, and to drum up publicity to sell more customer cars, the fine folks at Lola partnered with John Surtees and his racing squad. Surtees brought extensive experience across a variety of motorsports disciplines, and remains the only individual to have won both motorcycle and automotive racing world championships. He thus proved instrumental in design iterations that unlocked the full potential of the car, in addition to taking it racing. Indeed, with the large American V8s making more than 400 horsepower, and the eventual benefits of wind tunnel design, some T70s would find themselves topping 200 miles an hour on the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans, and from the start were breaking some track lap records previously held by much lighter Formula One machines. Surtees started this trend off almost immediately by breaking those records essentially while the car was still in a testing phase, taking the top spot from open-wheelers, I believe, at Brands Hatch and Donington, although I can't find my original source for that, so my memory may be slightly off. The car's first major racing outing came at one of the wettest international races of the era, the 1965 12 Hours of Sebring. More details in its own video on the channel, entered by our old friends over at the Mecum Racing Team. Though it qualified 6th, it was ahead of the Mecum Ferrari prototypes, but behind once and future President Dan Gurney's Lotus, the two Shelby Ford Racing GTs, Shelby Racing Ford GTs, and Jim Hall's inimitable Chaparrals that led the field. It was nevertheless one of the many frontrunners out before the rains came. A few victories came throughout the 1965 season, enough to bring more than a dozen orders for the car for use in multiple race series on both sides of the pond, but improvements based on Surtees' feedback and Broadley's vision of a better state were already in progress, bringing the Mark II for the 1966 season. This new iteration eliminated almost all of the steel in the monocoque in lieu of aluminium. Only the cross braces remained. A number of chassis components were riveted instead of welded, which apparently saves weight in race cars, despite, I believe, doing generally the opposite in warships. Paint was dispensed with, instead using colored fiberglass for decoration, and all of this saved more than 100 pounds, or about 45 kilos. Additional modifications included improvements to the cooling and suspension designs, with Surtees taking it out to an early victory to hoist the Guards International Trophy, besting Mr. Bruce McLaren himself by over a minute and a half. The Mark II's, and indeed the T70s as a whole, most brilliant set of results came in the newly created Canadian-American Challenge Cup, an essentially unrestricted series that had races, you guessed it, across the US and Canada. The cars were governed only by the loosest set of rules, a feature that attracted manufacturers and crowds in equal measure, but the result was that the racing was usually dominated by a single manufacturer. Lola's were the first. Surtees won the inaugural race at Mont-Tremblant and the season besides, taking home wins in the final two races to secure the championship, with two more races won, respectively, by Mark Donohue and once-and-future President Dan Gurney, the latter victory the only Can-Am win for a Ford engine, and I believe the only major victory for a T70 powered by a non-Chevy motor. The only non-Lola to take victory that year in the Can-Am Championship was Phil Hill in the Chaparral 2E, with Motorsports' first Triple Crown winner atop the podium at Laguna Seca and just ahead of team principal Jim Hall. On the other side of the pond, Denny Hulme, not yet working with Mr. McLaren, was tearing it up for Sid Taylor's racing team as well, and it seemed, at least in the UK, as though sports car racing might even overtake Formula One in popularity in the next few years, a state of affairs that certain interested parties could simply not allow to occur, and thus that inaugural year was also the finest year for Lola and the T70 in motorsport. On the North American side, Can-Am 67 saw the beginning of the Bruce and Denny Show era, with McLaren effectively dominating the championship until 1972, despite Mr. McLaren's unfortunate passing in June of 1970. In the UK, races that featured Groups 7 and 9, in which the T70s competed, were pretty much just cancelled wholesale without much explanation, which forced Broadley to pivot to focus on endurance racing and modify the T70 for eligibility in Group 6 and Group 4. The latter was a bit of a stretch, with a homologation requirement of 50 cars and more restrictive engineering rules, but by 1967, Lola had turned out a commendable 47 T70s, and so meeting the other requirements was considered feasible. This also meant that in Group 6, the T70 would be going up against its proverbial cousin? Stepbrother? Half-brother? Fellow Mark 6 descendant? You decide, comments below. But anyway, it would be going up against the GT40, now already distinguished in Le Mans competition. The Mark III was offered as both a Spider and a Coupe, but with relatively few mechanical changes, namely suspension updates for even wider tires, bigger brakes, and a 5-speed Hewland box. The bigger news was the offering of that shiny new Coupe bodywork, which is arguably its most iconic iteration. In this version, the influence of the GT40 and earlier Mark VI are increasingly evident. The design was to be compliant with the aforementioned Group 4 and 6 regulations, and thus the T70 dropped the cam-esque tail design of the Mark VI and most GT40 designs for a leveled rear deck and engine cover. However, unlike the GT40-derived J-car, which had a similar bread van rear, the T70's deck avoided a completely flat rear, instead ending in a small lip spoiler that prevented the phenomenon of high-speed lift, which, at least according to official stories, cost Ken Miles his life while testing the J-car. There are some reports that indicate Mr. Miles's passing was as the result of tire failure and that this cause was buried to protect corporate relationships, but perhaps unsurprisingly, verification of this is difficult, and as such, we will merely label it as apocryphal for the purposes of this video. This new rear lip brought much higher drag, nearly 50% more than the later Fords. The T70 Mark III had a drag coefficient of 0.47, whereas the Mark IV's was 0.35, but downforce tripled, which was just one of a suite of aerodynamic improvements for the Mark III, informed by wind tunnel experimentation and testing, overseen by our Mr. Southgate. In an effort to further improve the performance of the car, and to take an all-British victory at La Sarthe, the factory squad replaced their Chevy V8s with V8s sourced from Aston Martin for the 1967 season. These 5-liter quad-cam units seemed promising on pace. Their debut run at the Le Mans test had the T70's third fastest amongst the entrants, just behind the 2 Ferrari P4s, and performance at the Nürburgring 1000 km was solid until the car's suspension failed. But come Le Mans weekend, the Fords had been further improved to put their top speeds north of 340 kph, or that's about 200 miles an hour, more than 10 kilometers ahead of the Lola Aston, and more than 30 ahead of the fastest Ferrari, though the Ferraris remained more nimble in the corners. For Lola, however, Le Mans was a resounding failure. The first Lola of Surtees and David Hobbs retired with a broken piston after only 3 laps, while the second managed to hold 25 before succumbing to its own malaises, likely prompting this reaction from the team.
Oh, that is typical. Why has it done that?
The Aston project was scrapped shortly thereafter, to quelle surprise, and everyone went back to Chevy power plants for the remainder of the car's effective life. Then, surprise of surprises, the rules changed again, and 1968 saw the announcement that Group 6 was now only for 3-liter prototypes, and Group 4 had a 5-liter limit and a minimum production run of 50 vehicles, all of which had to be the same body style. These new restrictions came just months after a previous raft of changes that had required the T70s to have all the same body style to meet homologation, while previously Spyders and Coupes had both counted. But the original expectation was that they would all have 5.4-liter engines. The displacement change promised to ruin Lola's already strained finances and send them into receivership. But they were able to get a special dispensation to allow the car to run in 1968 as a 5-liter Group 4 car, which saved the company in the short term, but the car fared little better than mid-pack throughout the season. In 1969, the car's final year of effective international competition, further improvements to comply with the rule changes and hopefully grant the car a final swan song of victory led to the creation of the Mark IIIB. Mr. Broadley finally achieved his goal of a complete aluminum monocoque and added conventional doors, bigger brakes yet again, an improved 5-speed gearbox, twin headlamps per side, and fuel injection for the smaller 5-liter Chevy V8 that brought power up to around 450 bhp. This particular vehicle has also been fitted with a handy periscope for targeting merchant convoys and engaging in wolfpack tactics against roving bands of Ford GT40s. The headlamps also conceal torpedo tubes that provide improved attack power, magnetic proximity fuses, semi-active tracking, and excellent endgame maneuverability over contemporaneous offerings from Ford or Chevron. Actually, this car is for sale at time of recording, and since it's the only replica I believe I've featured in this video rather than original cars, it can be had for the relatively reasonable price of $350,000 US. Back in 1969, in spite of all the Mark IIIB's improvements, this final year was also less than spectacular. The international season started rather well, with an outright 1-2 after what can only be called a highly attritive 1969 24 Hours of Daytona, and this victory came despite issues for the winning Penske car with its fueling system that meant pitting twice as frequently as intended, and having Mr. Chuck Parsons serving as co-driver. This is not a casting of any aspersions against Mr. Parsons, but at the time he lacked any experience racing at Daytona or racing at night, which, in midwinter at Daytona, for those unaware, does take up a not insignificant portion of the race time. An outing at Le Mans was planned for the car in June, but after Sebring, the car was stolen and found shortly thereafter, having been stripped for parts and generally destroyed. Penske was unable to secure another chassis in time to make it to Le Mans, and thus his entry failed to materialize. The works team effort was similarly not in attendance, as they shuttered after Paul Hawkins lost his life driving a T70 at the RAC Tourist Trophy earlier that year, which also cast a pallor over their nominal victory in the race and a promising third in Le Mans Test Day, and thus the only T70 to make it to Le Mans that year was the Scuderia Filippinetti entry of Joe Bonnier and Maston Gregory. Their race also nearly failed to materialize after, during practice, I shouldn't laugh at this, but the car apparently sucked a bird through one of the cooling vents at speed and shot it into Bonnier's helmet, where it was promptly converted into its constituent components and made something of a mess of the cockpit. Indeed, the race didn't go much better for the team, with a transmission leak early on, followed by overheating that necessitated major engine work in the pits, and eventually brought the car's retirement at hour 13. However, they had been running as high as 6 when the car was healthy, so the performance was at least nominally there. There were additionally good results at national races in the UK, apart from the rather maudlin victory in the Tourist Trophy, and a rather dominant performance in South Africa in the Springbok Series. But in general, on the continent, the Chevy engines just really struggled to perform as well as they did in other venues. Their performance was likely due to the lower quality fuel that was in use in continental competition, while the Chevy engines were usually in a state of tune to use the higher quality avgas that was available in American racing. The use of this lower quality fuel reportedly caused combustion difficulties which were exacerbated by the lack of Chevrolet's support for the power plant. Thus, most T70 operators either tuned the engines themselves or relied on private tuners, which brought generally more variable work quality. It's worth remembering, of course, that GM didn't lend outright support to racing efforts in those days, but they were providing backdoor support to the efforts of McLaren and Chaparral. Decreases in required homologation volumes in 1969 made the newly introduced Porsche 917 and Ferrari 512 eligible for competition, confounding expectations that either company could manage to produce sufficient quantities of a big prototype, and sending the T70 into effective obsolescence by 1970 as the next generation matured into dominance. They were nominally succeeded by the 210 and 280 in international sports car racing, and by the T160 and T220 for the Can-Am Championship, that is T210 and 280, again with much greater success in the latter race series, but not until the series reboot in the late 70s, once the T333 came along. There were several attempts to convert the T70 Mark IIIs into another race car for the road, an always ambitious project that has grown increasingly challenging as top-flight racing cars have become more and more prototypey. I'll talk about a couple of those efforts in the next few weeks, but none of these came to any marketable fruition, driven in no small part by the necessarily Spartan interior, the monocoque chassis, with the engine as a semi-stressed member, and the lack of comforts that come from such things, really diminishing sales appeal. Nevertheless, over 100 T70s were sold in total, and the influence of the car on future designs was far greater than its standings in the race results would suggest. Aluminum or aluminium monocoques with fiberglass bodies would remain the fundamental building block for successful race vehicles until the appearance of carbon composite tubs. Aerodynamic-driven design certainly hasn't gone anywhere, and the philosophy of building chassis to accept a variety of engine designs has proliferated throughout the tiers of prototype competition, arguably culminating with the Daytona prototypes with their pick-and-mix approach, and in another vein with Lola's final models. The T70 also remains popular in historic competition, as we've seen with the sheer variety of vehicles presented in this video, with frequent entries from original vehicles as well as various high-quality replicas available for the less well-heeled among us. Earlier T70s, mostly Mark IIs, are generally less expensive than the later cars, with some Mark IIs seeing prices on Bring a Trailer around $250,000, but T70 Mark IIIs and Mark IIIBs generally commanding things on the higher end of the six-figure or low to mid-seven-figure range. The bright green machine that we're looking at right now, for instance, was sold a couple of years ago, listed with an ask of $1.1 million, although this premium was due in no small part to a complete ownership and maintenance history, which is virtually unheard of for a T70, and a Chevy V8 running on the very high end of the performance scale, reportedly north of 700 horsepower. At Daytona Historics this past weekend, it was, however, outclassed by Mr. Gerard Lopez's excellent-looking number 60 car, this due in no small part to the fact that Marcel Fassler was behind the wheel, and going up against a three-time Le Mans winner is going to be challenging pretty much no matter what. Mr. Lopez's other car, the ex-Ally Cadillac DPI VR, also sported a ringer in the driver's seat, one Mr. Butch Leitzinger, who was an absolutely delightful chap when I spoke to him last Thursday. That's how I know it's the ex-Ally car, as clearly the livery and numbers have changed a bit. As a final parting thought on the T70, I'm of the opinion that one of the things that we really saw starting to die with the car's retirement, and the retirement of its contemporaries, was top-class race cars as truly beautiful pieces of machinery. Love the 917 and some of the Group C cars for their aesthetics, but the ever-increasing demands of competition, science and technology, and engineering have rather robbed us of some of the, I don't want to say pure beauty because it makes me sound like even more of an aesthetic snob than I am, but nevertheless something in that vein. And I say this as someone who adores the early Audi R18s and the Peugeot 908 for how purposeful they are in their design while still bringing what I consider to be a compelling aesthetic to the table, but even then they are quite utilitarian. Food for thought, or comment fodder if you prefer. I'm just kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth at this point. Anyway, for this week's call to action not featuring the three sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
I do suspect I've used this one before, but I re-invite you all to join in my favorite Sunday tradition, that of Champagne Sunday. I started this tradition back during COVID as a way of kind of bringing a nice end to the week and setting up a positive mindset for the next one. It was actually brought on by my reading of someone's Master of Wine thesis that showed a significant correlation between one's greater enjoyment of sparkling wine while listening to classical music. Thus, the crux of Champagne Sunday is to put a bottle of champagne in the ice bucket and to enjoy it with a symphony or a couple of piano concertos. On the latter, I can personally recommend all of Rachmaninoff's, and I'm also partial to von Karajan's performances of Brahms' symphonies. If straight classical isn't quite to your liking, I understand. And as an alternate recommendation, there was also a chap named Jacques Lussier, who rearranged some of Bach's better-known compositions for jazz trios, and I find those quite enjoyable, if a bit unconventional. Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.